What if I told you that one of history's most horrific war crimes was deliberately covered up by the United States government? What if the perpetrators of experiments so brutal they make Nazi concentration camps look tame never faced justice? What if, instead of punishment, these war criminals were given immunity, money, and comfortable lives in exchange for their research data? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the true story of Unit 731. Between 1935 and 1945, in the frozen plains of Manchuria, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a secret facility. Its official designation was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Sounds harmless, doesn't it? Like something that would save lives. But behind that bureaucratic name lay one of the darkest chapters in human history. Inside this facility, Japanese scientists and military doctors conducted experiments on living human beings. Not volunteers, not soldiers, but innocent civilians, men, women, children, and infants. They were infected with deadly diseases, subjected to live dissections without anesthesia, frozen alive to study frostbite, placed in pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their skulls, and exposed to chemical weapons. The death toll? Conservative estimates suggest at least 10,000 people died in these experiments. Some historians believe the real number could be 3 times higher. And here's the most disturbing part. When World War II ended, the masterminds behind Unit 731 weren't hanged at Nuremberg-style trials. They weren't imprisoned. They walked free. Why? Because the United States wanted their data. This is the story of Unit 731, how it was created, what horrors occurred within its walls, and how its commanders escaped justice through one of the most controversial deals in post-war history. This is a story that governments tried to bury, that was hidden from the public for decades, and that reveals the darkest capabilities of human beings when morality is abandoned in the name of science and war. I'm going to warn you now, this video contains descriptions of extreme human suffering and medical atrocities. But this story needs to be told. These victims deserve to be remembered, and we need to understand how such evil can flourish and how it can be forgiven when it serves powerful interests. Let's begin with the man who started it all.
Every atrocity needs an architect. For Unit 731, that architect was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. Born in 1892 to a wealthy landowning family in Chiba Prefecture, Ishii was brilliant from a young age. He graduated from Kyoto Imperial University with a degree in medicine in 1920 and joined the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps. By all accounts, he was charismatic, ambitious, and utterly devoid of empathy. In the 1920s, Ishii became obsessed with biological warfare. He traveled throughout Europe and observed how other nations were secretly developing biological weapons programs, despite the 1925 Geneva Protocol that banned them. Ishii returned to Japan with a radical proposal. Japan should develop its own biological weapons program, not just for defense, but as an offensive military strategy. His pitch was simple and seductive. Biological weapons were cheap to produce, incredibly effective, and difficult to trace. A small amount of bacteria could decimate an entire city. It was the perfect weapon for a nation like Japan, which lacked the natural resources for a prolonged conventional war. But Ishii understood a critical problem. You couldn't develop biological weapons effectively using animal testing alone. To understand how diseases affected humans, to determine the most lethal doses, to develop delivery systems that would maximize casualties, you needed human test subjects. In 1932, Ishii got his wish. The Japanese military established a secret research facility in Barenblatt, a village in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, now northeast China. This was the precursor to Unit 731. Initially called the Togo Unit, it was remote, far from prying eyes, and located in occupied territory where Japanese authorities had absolute power. But Ishii wanted more. He wanted a larger facility, more resources, and complete autonomy. In 1936, he got it. The Japanese military constructed a massive complex near the city of Harbin in Manchuria. It covered 6 square kilometers and included laboratories, barracks, crematoria, administrative buildings, and breeding facilities for plague-infected fleas. The complex had its own airport, its own railway line, and over 150 buildings. At its peak, it employed more than 3,000 people, doctors, scientists, engineers, and support staff. This was Unit 731, and Shiro Ishii was its commander. Ishii created a culture of scientific detachment within Unit 731. The victims weren't called prisoners or even test subjects. They were called maruta, logs of wood. This linguistic dehumanization made it easier for the staff to conduct their experiments. They weren't experimenting on people, they were just processing logs. Who were these logs? Mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, but also Soviet prisoners, Korean independence fighters, and even some Allied prisoners of war. Anyone deemed an enemy of the Japanese Empire could end up at Unit 731. Once you entered the facility, you never left alive. The victims included men, women, pregnant women, children, and infants. Age didn't matter, gender didn't matter. All that mattered was having a human body that could generate data. And what kind of experiments did Ishii authorize? To understand that, we need to go deeper into the facility itself. We need to understand what happened inside those buildings. Be warned, what comes next is deeply disturbing, but it's important that you hear it, because this isn't ancient history. Many of the perpetrators lived long, comfortable lives well into the 1980s and 1990s. Some became successful doctors and professors after the war. This happened within living memory, and it was deliberately covered up.
The experiments conducted at Unit 731 fall into several categories: biological warfare research, chemical warfare research, and what can only be described as sadistic curiosity masquerading as science. Let's start with the biological warfare experiments, which were Ishii's primary focus. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, tuberculosis, and other deadly diseases. But here's what makes it particularly horrific. They weren't just infected and observed. They were vivisected, dissected alive without anesthesia, so researchers could observe the disease's progression in living organs. Why no anesthesia? The official justification was that anesthesia might affect the disease's progression and compromise the data. But survivors from the facility staff later admitted that screams were common, and the researchers simply didn't care. The victims were logs, remember? Logs don't have feelings. One researcher, who later confessed, described dissecting a pregnant woman infected with syphilis, removing the fetus, and then dissecting the fetus as well, all while both were still alive. He said he felt nothing at the time. It was just another experiment. The plague research was particularly extensive. Unit 731 bred plague-infected fleas in massive quantities. Researchers would infect prisoners with plague, document the symptoms in meticulous detail, and then dissect them at various stages of the disease. The goal was to weaponize plague and develop aerial dispersal methods. And they tested these methods in real combat. Between 1940 and 1942, Japanese planes dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, including Ningbo, Changde,
and Kuaizhou. Plague outbreaks followed, killing thousands of Chinese civilians. These were field tests of Unit 731's biological weapons. Entire cities became laboratories. Then there were the frostbite experiments. Manchuria is bitterly cold in winter, and the Japanese military wanted to understand how to treat frostbite in their soldiers. So prisoners were taken outside in sub-zero temperatures, their arms or legs exposed or doused with water, and left to freeze solid. Researchers would strike the frozen limbs with sticks to test their solidity. They produced a sound, witnesses recalled, like hitting wood. Once frozen, the prisoners were subjected to various thawing methods. Some were thawed with warm water, others with cold water, others with direct heat. The goal was to determine the most effective treatment. Most prisoners lost their limbs or died from complications. The researchers recorded everything. Pressure chamber experiments tested the limits of human survival. Prisoners were placed in hypobaric chambers where air pressure was reduced to simulate extreme altitudes. Researchers documented how long it took for victims' eyes to hemorrhage, for their organs to rupture, for them to lose consciousness and die. The data would be useful, they reasoned, for high-altitude aviation and submarine warfare. Chemical warfare experiments were equally brutal. Prisoners were exposed to mustard gas, phosgene, hydrogen cyanide, and other chemical agents. Some were placed in gas chambers. Others were tied to stakes in open fields while chemical weapons were detonated nearby. Researchers recorded the time to death, the symptoms, the effectiveness of various dosages. And then there were experiments that served no obvious military purpose. They were simply torture disguised as research. Prisoners were deprived of food and water to study starvation and dehydration. They were injected with animal blood to study blood transfusion compatibility. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work, and the results are agonizing. They were subjected to massive doses of X-rays to study radiation effects. They were hung upside down to see how long it took for them to die. They were spun in centrifugal forces until they lost consciousness or died. Some prisoners were used for weapons testing. They were tied to stakes at various distances from explosions so researchers could study blast injuries and shrapnel patterns. Others were used for flamethrower tests or for testing grenades at close range. Female prisoners were systematically raped by guards and researchers. Those who became pregnant were sometimes used for experiments on pregnancy and childbirth, or for experiments on venereal diseases. Newborn infants were used in experiments as well. No one was spared. What's particularly chilling is how systematic and bureaucratic it all was. Every experiment was documented. Detailed reports were written. Photographs were taken. Data was carefully recorded in ledgers. The researchers published papers based on their findings, though they falsely claimed the subjects were volunteers or animals. Former Unit 731 staff who spoke decades later described an environment of complete moral detachment. New staff members were required to participate in dissections of living prisoners as a form of initiation. If you refused, you were suspected of being sympathetic to the enemy and could face punishment yourself. Most learned to suppress their conscience and view the work as simply their job. One veteran recalled his first day. "I was told we were doing important work for the emperor and the nation. The logs weren't really human," they told me. "They were enemies who would kill Japanese soldiers if given the chance. It was us or them." After a while, you started to believe it. By conservative estimates, at least 10,000 people died in Unit 731's experiments between 1935 and 1945. Some historians believe the number could be 30,000 or higher when you include satellite facilities and field tests. We'll never know the exact number, because Ishii ordered most records destroyed at the end of the war. But here's the question that should haunt us. How did they get away with it?
In August 1945, the world changed. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The game was over. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Shiro Ishii saw it coming. Days before the official surrender, he ordered Unit 731 to destroy all evidence. Buildings were dynamited, equipment was smashed, documents were burned. The remaining prisoners, several hundred people, were killed either by lethal injection, poison gas, or simply shot and cremated. No witnesses could be left alive. Ishii ordered his staff to disperse and return to Japan. They were told to never speak of their work. They were told to destroy any personal documents or photographs. They were told that if anyone asked, Unit 731 was simply a water purification unit, nothing more. The Soviet Red Army reached Harbin on August 19th, just days after the surrender. They found the Unit 731 complex already destroyed, still smoldering. Bodies of prisoners were found in the ruins, but most of the evidence was gone. The Soviets captured some lower-level staff members who hadn't escaped, but Ishii and most of the senior researchers had already made it back to Japan. Here's where the story takes a dark turn into international politics. When the United States occupied Japan, they began investigating Japanese war crimes. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, similar to the Nuremberg trials in Germany, was established to prosecute major war criminals. Hideki Tojo and other military leaders were tried and executed. But Unit 731 wasn't mentioned at the Tokyo trials. Why? Because American military intelligence, specifically the Chemical Corps and biological warfare experts, realized that Unit 731's research represented an unprecedented treasure trove of data. The United States had its own biological weapons program at Fort Detrick in Maryland, but it was constrained by ethical limitations. American researchers couldn't conduct experiments on humans. But the Japanese had, for over a decade, with meticulous documentation. In 1946, American investigators tracked down Shiro Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders. Instead of arresting them, they made a deal. The deal was simple. Ishii and his team would turn over all their research data, provide detailed reports of their experiments, and cooperate fully with American biological warfare researchers. In exchange, they would receive immunity from prosecution. They would not be tried as war criminals, they would not be handed over to the Soviets or the Chinese, both of whom wanted them for trial and execution. The Americans justified this deal in the context of the emerging Cold War. The Soviet Union was now the enemy. The USSR had captured some Unit 731 personnel and had obtained some data. The Americans couldn't let the Soviets have an advantage in biological warfare. National security, they argued, required obtaining this data at any cost. And the cost was justice. Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, one of the American investigators, later expressed regret about the deal. He said, "I didn't know what I was dealing with at first. By the time I understood the full extent of what they had done, the deal was already made. Political and military considerations overrode everything else." General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied occupation of Japan, approved the immunity deal. Documents declassified decades later revealed that officials in Washington explicitly stated that the value of the research data exceeded the value of prosecuting the individuals involved. The data was shipped to Fort Detrick. American biological warfare researchers studied it extensively. They later admitted that some of the data was scientifically valuable, particularly regarding pathogen dispersal methods and disease progression rates. But much of it was simply confirmation of things they already knew or could have learned through ethical research methods. Was it worth granting immunity to mass murderers? In retrospect, many historians and ethicists say no. The scientific value didn't justify the moral cost. But the deal was done, and Shiro Ishii and his colleagues walked free.
So what happened to the men of Unit 731 after the war? Shido Ishii himself lived comfortably in Tokyo until his death in 1959 from throat cancer. He was never arrested, never charged, never faced a trial. He lived in his own home, received his military pension, and occasionally consulted for American biological warfare researchers who would visit him in Japan. When he died at age 67, his funeral was well attended by former colleagues and military associates. He was remembered in obituaries as a distinguished medical researcher and patriotic officer who served his country. The words war criminal never appeared. Other Unit 731 leaders fared even better. Masaji Kitano, who succeeded Ishii as commander of Unit 731, became president of the Green Cross Corporation, a pharmaceutical company. He lived a prosperous life until his death in 1986 at age 92. Ryoichi Naito, another senior researcher, founded his own pharmaceutical company after the war and became wealthy. He donated money to medical charities and was regarded as a respectable businessman until his death in 1982 at age 92. Hideo Futaki became a professor at Tokyo University. Hirotomo Asakasa became president of Kanazawa Medical University. Yoshio Shinozuka became a director at a major pharmaceutical company. Many former Unit 731 members became doctors, professors, medical researchers, or pharmaceutical executives in post-war Japan. They published papers, taught students, treated patients, and lived normal, respectable lives. Their past was hidden. The Japanese government didn't acknowledge Unit 731's existence. The American government kept the files classified. The victims and survivors had no voice. The Chinese government, under Mao Zedong, was focused on civil war and revolution and didn't initially pursue justice for Unit 731 victims. The Soviet Union held a war crimes trial in Khabarovsk in 1949, where some captured Unit 731 members testified, but this trial was largely dismissed by the West as Soviet propaganda during the early Cold War. It wasn't until the 1980s that the truth about Unit 731 began to emerge publicly. Japanese journalists and historians started investigating. Chinese survivors started speaking out. American documents were gradually declassified under Freedom of Information Act requests. In 1984, a Japanese investigative journalist named Keiichi Tsuneishi published his research on Unit 731, revealing names of perpetrators who were still alive and living comfortably in Japan. His work shocked the Japanese public, many of whom had never heard of Unit 731. Then in 1989, construction workers in Tokyo discovered human remains buried at the site of what had been a Unit 731-related facility. Forensic analysis revealed the remains showed signs of experimentation, drill holes in skulls, surgical cuts, evidence of dissection. This physical evidence made denial impossible. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, more former Unit 731 members broke their silence. Guilt, old age, and desire to confess before death led some to give interviews and write memoirs. Their testimonies confirmed the worst allegations and revealed even more horrors that had been suppressed. But by then, most of the perpetrators were already dead. Shido Ishii died in 1959. Most senior members died in the 1970s and 1980s. Even the lower-level staff were dying of old age by the 1990s. Justice delayed had become justice denied. To this day, the Japanese government has never officially apologized specifically for Unit 731. There have been general apologies for wartime actions, but no explicit acknowledgement and apology for the biological warfare experiments. No compensation has been paid to victims' families. No memorial has been built by the Japanese government to honor the victims. The United States has also never officially apologized for granting immunity to Unit 731 leaders. The declassified documents are available to researchers, but there's been no formal acknowledgement that the decision was morally wrong.
The only significant memorial to Unit 731 victims is in China, at the site of the former Unit 731 complex in Harbin, which has been preserved as museum. Visitors can walk through the ruins and see the evidence of what occurred there, but relatively few people in the West know it exists.
So why does Unit 731 matter today? Why tell this story now, 80 years after the end of World War II? Because it teaches us crucial lessons about human nature, about the dangers of dehumanization, and about how easily morality can be abandoned when we convince ourselves that the ends justify the means. First, Unit 731 shows us how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when placed in the right circumstances. The researchers weren't monsters from birth. They were educated doctors and scientists from respectable families. But they were placed in an environment where atrocities were normalized, where victims were linguistically dehumanized as logs, where refusing to participate could make you suspect, and where institutional authority gave permission for the unthinkable. This is the banality of evil that philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about. Evil doesn't always look like a cackling villain. Sometimes it looks like a bureaucrat filling out forms, a scientist recording data, a doctor performing procedures. When we stop seeing others as fully human, when we reduce them to categories, enemy, criminal, other, we open the door to atrocity. Second, Unit 731 reveals how easily governments can prioritize political and military interests over justice and morality. The United States made a calculated decision. Obtaining biological warfare data was more valuable than prosecuting war criminals. National security concerns in the emerging Cold War trumped justice for the victims. This set a dangerous precedent. It told the world that if your crimes are useful enough to powerful nations, you can escape accountability. It reinforced the cynical belief that international justice only applies to the weak and defeated, not to those who can offer something valuable. Third, Unit 731 reminds us that silence and denial allow evil to persist. For decades, the Japanese government didn't acknowledge Unit 731. Textbooks didn't mention it. The perpetrators lived comfortable lives while their victims were forgotten. It was only when journalists, historians, and survivors insisted on speaking the truth that acknowledgement began to emerge. This matters because historical memory is crucial. When we forget or deny atrocities, we risk repeating them. When we remember and confront them, we create cultural antibodies against future horrors. What can we do now? The perpetrators are dead. The victims can never be brought back. But we can remember. We can educate. We can ensure that Unit 731 is taught in schools, documented in history books, and never forgotten. We can support survivors and their families in their quest for official acknowledgement and apology. We can visit the Unit 731 Museum in Harbin and bear witness to what happened there. Most importantly, we can remain vigilant. We can recognize the warning signs when dehumanization begins in our own societies. When we start thinking of others as less than human, whether because of nationality, race, religion, or ideology, we're walking the path that led to Unit 731. We can demand accountability when governments make moral compromises for political convenience. We can insist that human rights are non-negotiable, even in times of war, even when it's strategically inconvenient. The story of Unit 731 is a story of humanity at its worst. But it's also a story that needed to be told, because the victims deserve to be remembered, because the truth matters, and because we have a responsibility to learn from history's darkest chapters so we never repeat them. Thank you for watching this difficult video. I know it wasn't easy to hear, but it was important. If you learned something today, if this story moved you, please share this video. The victims of Unit 731 had their voices taken away. We can give them a voice by telling their story. In the description below, I've included links to academic sources, museums, and organizations dedicated to remembering Unit 731 and advocating for acknowledgement and education. If you want to learn more, those resources are there for you. Take care of yourselves, remember the victims, and never forget that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against dehumanization and cruelty. Thank you for watching.